Ladies and gentlemen, Meghan Newell.
Well, hello there. I am Meghan, and today I'm going to be talking to you about breaking out of the screen. Broadly, it's going to be how you can use your existing Cinema 4D skills to take those assets and put them into augmented reality or make them into a model to print. So let me talk a bit about what sort of screens we're breaking out of. I'm a visual designer, art director, illustrator, motion designer, developer. A lot of syllables, but basically I like to say that I make pretty things on my computer for money. I've been doing this since about 2002, and things keep moving, and I get curious and keep trying new things. I did, as he said, give a talk for Maxon in 2013, and at that point my work kind of looked like this. I was talking about style frames and design using Cinema 4D. I had come up as a Flash designer and developer using ActionScript, and I moved on into broadcast and learned Cinema 4D back in 2004. I worked for a lot of accounts on MTV, ABC, CMT, and other things that rhyme with E. A couple of other highlights was being one of the many monkeys on the typewriter who were designing all the backgrounds for the iPod spots that ended up on billboards and commercials. There was also that time that I told the pickup artist what to do and where to put himself as an art director, designer, and animator on the VH1 show. There was that other time where I worked on the team that put Twitter on the air for the first time while I was at Current TV. And there I was working a lot of show packages and doing design of the TVs and TV shows and promos. Using Cinema 4D for fun things like this, lots of lens flares. And so my talk then was about some of the work I had done at the mill. Now, however, augmented reality and 3D printing. Another leap. How did we get there? I spent about 6 months doing a residency in Mozilla's XR Studio program, kind of digging into what people can do with augmented reality. I spent 6 months working as an immersive designer at Google on their Lens product, looking at design for immersive spaces as well as more broadly how they talked about augmented reality in their marketing. And then 6 months working on a character design exhibition. So all of these things kind of are flavors in the pot that are going to go into this talk. But the biggest one really that caused me to break out of the screen might be the 5 years that I spent working on Lyft. And now this is Lyft with a Y. This is genuinely a question that I fielded many times when I started there. I started in 2013 when they were this tiny company of 70 people, and they looked a little like this. I pitched them on doing this hand-drawn typography for some driver stories, which ended up going through a bunch of ads and promos and on their website and helped develop the core of their brand at the time in opposition to what Uber was. So we were that friendly friend with a car against their private driver branding. On a shoestring, I worked on this explainer for them. And it's interesting to look back on this and see that some of the press it was getting was talking about how it tells you that ride sharing is safe and nothing like hitchhiking, which, now 5 years later, we can't even think of it. We all call up our Lyfts at the airport, but 5 years has gone fast. That hand-drawn typography thing, I loved it up, used it all over the place, and I grew out of my motion graphics background into getting to do some things that look similar, but also email designs and swag and character designs, branding and rebranding. We rebranded 3 times over the course that I was there. And lots of different stuff, interactive pages, tons of illustrations and ads and animations for quick little things. And you can see how Cinema 4D continues to play a role in the work that I was doing. It's always been one of these tools in my toolkit, not necessarily the thing that I use every day all the time, but that thing that always comes in handy. So here's an example that'll look familiar to style frame and motion graphics people. I would do 3 different versions of an ad, one in an illustrated version, one in a photographic version, and one in a 3D version, which would then be expanded out. Using Cinema 4D for assets for interactive pages, for product visualizations, for random stuff to throw on our social channels or at the top of a website, and interestingly, to be able to previs an award that later was printed in cement and sent to people. Lots of experimentation on my own time. And as I was working at Lyft, my role continued to change and evolve, which I loved. I had the opportunity to art direct outside artists and illustrators, so I could focus on the design work of things that were even printed. And there was also that time I finally got to be the client. I had been a freelancer for so long working at motion graphics places, and I had the opportunity to be the client for Buck recreating our explainer 4 years later, which was an interesting process. And for all of you freelancers out there, when you think your producers are not protecting you, they're probably protecting you way more than you think, because they shut down a lot of our crazy ideas. We did not have the kind of budget they wanted. So, visual designer, art director, illustrator, motion designer, developer. All of these things I like to do and incorporate into my work. And as Lyft grew bigger and bigger, there was more of a need for us to specialize in a single role. A company of 70 and a company of 3,500 are very different places. So I made one last transition there, and I moved over to product design for my last 10 months. And I ended up spending 10 months working on this space, basically. How do you spend 10 months on 2,500 pixels? I could do a whole talk just about that. Let's condense a little and say it involves half of the building wanting to do something that looks like the top, and the other people on the other side of the building wanting to do something that looks like on the bottom. And then this idea that they wanted to condense these big, broad ideas into this little tiny space. So we did lots of experimentation around it. But in the end, it was this space that I was working with. And after I got out of working on that space, I just needed to put things everywhere. And so augmented reality, enter augmented reality. I left Lyft and I started experimenting around about just designing the whole world. And so that's what we're going to talk about first, is augmented reality. One last note on this slide. So I'm all these things. What I'm not is a specialist. As I said, I'm not in Cinema 4D every day all the time. So having used it for 15 years, I've got a broad knowledge of lots of different things, but there might be somebody else who can answer very specific questions about random stuff, or maybe I can answer it. I don't know. It's a big program. What I do as a generalist is I attack a concept and use every different thing that I can think of, including like spit shine, looking things up on Stack Overflow, and duct tape if need be, to try to make this random concept in my head come to life. And that's what I did with this. This is Presence. It's an AR app that I developed while I was at the XR Studio program. And we were looking a lot into uses for augmented reality, and a lot of the talk around it revolves around games. And while I game, I'm not a gamer per se, and I always feel like when I invest a lot of time in something, I always want to see this like creative result of it, and I feel like there's a lot of that sort of urge. So I wanted to make this kind of 3D greeting card where you could send somebody this scene that you create with assets, and they could open it up and have that experience. So let's start by looking at the app, and then we're going to talk through primitives, cloners, random modifier. We're going to talk about file prep and formatting to get it out of Cinema and into Xcode. And I'll be dealing with the Xcode environment in general. I found it a great place to start because they had really solid documentation. And ARKit had a lot of bells and whistles. We're going to also talk about materials and how to use them in both Cinema 4D and Xcode. and how to make contact shadows, which is a really important thing to cheat when you're working with augmented reality right now. This is kind of the influence of what I was doing. I was going for kind of that color factory aesthetic where you have these experiential displays. And let's quickly look at what presence looks like. So, AR, you've always got to get your environment. And there we go. And then we can put down some fun things. I want another one closer to me. Give me another plane. It thinks my plane is way over here. There we go. Hello. Hello, friends. You are all my friends. So you can move it around and you can place your objects in here and you can put some really cool little guys. And there's even some fun little rainbows, which is what we're going to look at next. There we go, a rainbow. So this is the object that we'll look at. Let's jump into Cinema. So this is what our friend looks like when he's all rendered out in Cinema. It's got kind of a fun vinyl texture. We're not going to use that. We're going to simplify it way down before we bring it in. And let's look for a second at how we might model that. So I was sticking to pretty basic things with this, trying to go with the primitive objects. We'll grab a torus for the first of our rainbow, and we'll make him a little bit bigger and a whole lot skinnier. And then I'm going to flip him up with this and slice him to give us the first of our rainbows. And we'll do a lot of cloners, but for this initial pass, I'm going to do it simply and with math. So we know that our radius is 8 pixels. So doubling it is 16. I'm going to go down here and subtract 16 to get my next loop. And then, sorry, it wanted it to be 8 to get my 16. Okay, there we go. And I think I'm going to do a little bit less than that to get a nice overlap. So instead of doing my 16, I'm going to subtract 14 and then continue out the rainbow and make myself a nice couple of friends here. Last guy, and I am option dragging to duplicate them. And then my original materials were vinyl, but the material I'm going to use to bring into Xcode has just the color channel enabled, so I can pick out and have the color brought in, but not any of the extra information. I'll put those guys on all of the different friends. And then after we have that, I'm going to group it and use a cloner to do our next part of it. So select them all and Option G to group. And I'll call this Rainbow. Keep it tidy. Remember to label. And then grab a cloner friend and stick it on there. So we're going to use linear for this. We're in the right ballpark, but I don't want it to go up. I want it to go out. So I'll go back to my math again, and this time I'm going to use the full 16 so they lay next to each other nicely. And we have a rainbow. So then let's talk about our happy little clouds. The clouds that I was looking at were, they had lots of variation in size. So let's look at some ways that we can get that. I'm going to start off with a big sphere, and this one is going to be I'll call it large. He is going to be used for our cloner shape. And then I'm going to grab another little sphere, name him small little friend, and he'll be about 20 radius. And now I need to grab another instance of the cloner object, and I'm going to put my small in there. Right now it's still linear, so I need to give it an object reference so we can use the object cloner. There we go. So this is on surface mode, and it's just aligning it to the surface, but there are a couple of other options here, and in this case, I think this vertex shader is pretty nice. It will allow me to put each one of those objects where the lines meet at the vertex. So we'll switch it to vertex and check it out. That's something. Kind of looks like a golf ball. The next thing we're going to do is look at the number of segments on the object and drop it down so we have less objects in there. And I'm also going to change this to hexahedron because I liked kind of the randomness of where that landed. And I think we can go even further down and use 8. So let's see what our cloner looks like now. All right, something. That's something. We'll drop him down a little bit more. And then I am going to go in, make this guy white. I'm going to make my smalls a little bigger. And then I'm going to add a random effector on here to start to get that variation in the size. So let's do MoGraph Effector random. And make sure it is added to my friend. Okay, so it's really random. We don't want it quite that random. Let's remove the position and look just at that scale. I want to check uniform, so it is staying X and Y scaled the same. And I'll do a negative 0.5. And that's starting to be interesting. I'm going to make these guys a little bigger, I think. And then I want to play with my random effector and try out the different seeds and see what kind of different effects I can get. And I think I like that guy pretty well. So the last thing I'm going to do is make this guy editable now. So I can do the final adjustments with the scale tool, kind of scale him in and maybe expand him out a little bit. And I'm going to call that a cloud. So once again, I'll Option G, group them into a cloud. And I'm going to use one more fun thing from this menu. I'm going to use an instance so I can make two clouds with all of that existing geometry. Let's pop out into our 4 view so I can make sure that they're all lined up. I would like both of them, please. And spread them out. And now we've got a simple little model. I think those clouds are probably bigger than I want them. We'll scale them uniformly a little bit. All right, so at this point, I could bring this right into Xcode by just exporting it as a DAE. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. The nice thing about Xcode is it will read all of that randomness, all of the toruses, the instances, the cloners. It all came in and it read. So you can just get that directly in there. I would not recommend it, however. A better way to do it is to reduce all of your geometry to as simple as you can. And the outermost grouping is important to keep it named properly because we'll be referring to it in the code and we'll be iterating through that file structure. So the way we planet over here is important. I'm going to delete out the scene and the other examples. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to C key to make this editable. And then grab it all and go to Object, Connect Object, and Delete. So I get just the simple geometry here. I'll do that again to the other friend. Connect Object and Delete. And finally to our rainbow. And keep it named. All of these objects I'm going to group up again and make sure they're named properly so Xcode recognizes them. And then I will export here as a DAE file. A DAE file is a good interchange format that Xcode can read. Call this that. In this export option, we don't have to worry about animation or triangles. Interestingly, DAE can use animation. It can use scale and position. It can't use point level animation, but it can do the scale and the position and rigged models. So it can be useful, but not for this example. Well, OK. And then let's find our file and bring it into Xcode. Here is the rainbow. There's my DAE. And when you're dragging files into Xcode, it is creating a file structure on your hard drive. So it's similar to just option dragging it into the file structure. And we get this rainbow DAE. And the first thing we have to do is convert it to a scene file format. So we've now got our little play friend, our rainbow, nicely named. And I want to look at how you deal with textures in Xcode. Similar to in Cinema 4D, you can use HDRI images to provide the information. So I'm going to put this modern atrium, nice sort of softer background for the whole thing. And then when I go into the actual rainbow texture, I'm going to use a different HDRI image on the reflective channel. So I'm going to take this Pritzker Pavilion one and place it on here. You get this nice big shine, and you can play with the values to see how shiny you would like it to be. The other thing that I found would be good for this project is to add the color to the emission channel as well. So it stayed a little bit brighter and truer, emitting on the light. And I definitely invite you to look into the documentation that ARKit has on their materials, because they're really well put out and there's lots of information to be had. So this is what I like for the balloon, the nice shiny thing. The cloud, I'm going to use a similar technique, putting HDRI image in the reflective channel. But I'm going to tamp this one down a lot more because the white didn't seem to have reflections as much. And then I will, oh, this is fine actually. About 0.24 is pretty good. I'll do a couple more of the rainbow colors just so you can see the process one more time. It's selecting the diffuse color, adding it to the emission channel, and depending, you might want to take it down a bit, and then adding a HDRI image to the reflective channel to get those nice highlights. And let's do it to the blue, and I'm going to do it to, the red and the orange are actually really an awful color. Look at how awful that orange is. But when you stick some of the orange in the emission channel, it gets much brighter and happier, and then you stick the HDRI image on it, and you get those nice reflections. Okay, so let's now export this and see how we're doing with it. Oh, it takes so long to compile. Okay, so we've got a rainbow there, and we've got some shading, and we've got some highlights, and it's starting to look like it has a ballooniness to it. So I'm going to leave that one right now, and I'm going to talk about the contact shadows, which is another important topic for putting your objects out. For this example, I'm using this one that I set up where there's already a ground plane. Most often you would probably be using this when you're placing an object on the ground, and you could do it by putting a transparent shadow that was textured to a surface plane. But we'll simplify it and use this. A couple of things about bringing it into Xcode. Stuff like this, this layer shader, will not read in Xcode. It will come up and look like you can see the flat color on there. It doesn't read the stripes when you just bring it in directly. It also doesn't like frontal projection or any of the fancier different ways of putting on textures. Everything needs to be UVW mapped. Luckily, there is a nice tool in here that we're going to look at, which is this Bake Object tool. So I'll run through a quick way of generating a texture and then some shadows off of it. I'm going to uncheck Illuminate, Ambient Occlusion, and Normals. We just want to get the color here. And then I'm going to increase the pixel size because it's going over this whole object. So it needs to have some information to work with. And I will place it in my building texture folder. It doesn't matter where I put it. I'll put it right here. And I'm going to call this one color. Bake. And it's going to generate this nice UVW map for me. And this is step one. At this point, I'm going to go through my export process and generate my file. We'll call it buildings and use the DAE again. Same format there. And now I'm going to go back and make my shadow pass. And the way I do the shadow pass is by looking at each one of these textures and going through and adding this white instead of the colored layer to it. And I want to make sure that on this white layer, it's just a color, there's no reflectance on it. And I will once again run my bake object, and this time I'm going to call it shadow. So let's bake it. Oh, it gave me nothing because I didn't check ambient occlusion and illuminate, which are the passes that we're working with. This should look a little bit better. So now we've got our passes, and if you've done this, the flow going into After Effects, it feels very similar to me, where you generate your passes and you realign them. Let's jump over to Keynote and see, or to Xcode and see how that works. I'm going to open up my buildings file, do a similar drag and drop of the DAE. Once I have this guy in here, I can go to my thing, and it's come right over. I've got my illumination. Oh, that's the one I already did. Let's look at our buildings, and we'll recreate that process together. Convert it to a scene kit file. I'm going to remove the sun and the shadow light, which I used in Cinema. And one quick thing about how I generated these shadows. The general process was I had one ambient light to light the scene, and then I had a shadow caster light that was just a direct light. But I don't need those anymore. Take them out. On this buildings, I'm going to select it, go into my textures, and I'm going to get my passes and drag them over. We got an ambient occlusion, a color, and our surface color. And before I show you the magic, I want to show you one other thing and mention Apple does have lights within here, so you can light with a spotlight. However, it's harder to get the fine-tuned control. I think coming from Cinema 4D, it's nice to be able to have that control with the lightings. So before we do this, I do want to show you what it looks like to do Apple's light. So they have a nice light here, which you can fool around with, but it's not giving me the shadows. I'm going to delete that out and stop and show you without the light there is already some ambient light, and this is the last time we'll look at it pre-effect, and then we'll add our effect in. So this is before we add our shadow for a reference again. And you can see that you do see shading in there, but you just don't see those contact shadows. So back to our buildings. We're going to grab them and put our passes on now. On our multiply channel, we're going to bring in our ambient occlusion. And on our illumination, we'll bring in that shadow surface color and export and see how we do. Oh, that's not correct. I need to change the file name. We put in a new and interesting one. It's no longer buildings start, it's buildings. One other cool thing about Xcode that I would be totally remiss if I did not tell you about, because it caused a lot of things for me, is that there is this tag. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Here are our shadows. We've got nice shadows that came in from Cinema that you can fully customize. And the idea is you want them to be a general shadow, not very directional, so that way it will look okay no matter what sort of lighting is in the real world. Okay, all done with augmented reality. Take a big breath. Okay, now I'm going to talk about another and completely different thing. This guy, I would like you to meet Jen. So Jen is a 3D character that I developed and then ended up bringing out into the real world. It started from this bunch of avatars that I had illustrated, and I liked them as a set, but I found that I did not like the little old lady character very much. And as a future little old lady, I thought maybe this is something I should look at. So I tried to make a badass little old lady and went through this development process, looking at these sort of references, and ended up with this guy. So I learned a whole lot about the physical aspects of it, and this is just the tip of the iceberg on that one. But what we're going to talk about is when you're in Cinema, what do you do if you've done this dope model? And I've heard some of the other speakers, and they're talking about really cool character design stuff. So if you've learned this cool character design stuff and you want to bring it out, I would like to talk you through that and help you over some of the hoops. I'm going to talk about selection sets, polygon management, this amazing little plugin that's called Magic Merge, and extrusion, viewport clipping, mesh checking, and then file prep and format. Whew! All right. So this is what the model that I eventually sent to the printer looked like. Much cleaner than when I started. You can notice, notably, that there is an interior geometry as well as an exterior geometry. And this is an important concept for 3D printing. There are some printers, I think the MakerBot, their slicer will deal with geometry that isn't defined a width, but most of them like you to put that width on. So a lot of things online will show you how to do this by doing an extrude, which is cool if you're working with a cube like this. You can just take it out. You can select all of your polys and then empty, extrude it, and you can see how you can get that geometry. And this tells the printer where it should be printing. But when you're dealing with a model as complicated as that character is, it's not realistic to just extrude the whole thing. There are way too many polys you're dealing with. So one of the gotchas about this one I want to show you right off is when I render this right now, it looks super smooth and lovely, but it's all a lie. It has this Fong tag on it, which will give some automatic smoothing to it. And if I remove that Fong tag and look, I can see what the actual polygon count looks like. So it's a good one to check through and make sure how that looks. I am now going to jump over to a lower poly version of this file. I want to tell you a little bit about why you would use a Magic Merge plugin. So if you just merge all your objects together with the Connect Objects and Delete, you're going to get interior geometry like this hair. And you can get a good visualization on that by going to project settings, edit, project settings, and looking at your view clipping. If you're in a tiny view clipping, you can't see inside your object, but if you pop it out to this huge or custom, you can get in there and see how it does. And once you use a Magic Merge plugin, you can see that there's no interior geometry. It puts everything together and takes out the middle. And let's look at a quick example on a simpler object so you can really get the idea of that. So we have a cone and a cube per se. And if I just stick them together with my Connect Object and Delete, I'm going to end up seeing lots of things in there. Edit, settings. It's going to keep that geometry. That will definitely confuse the printer. So if I go here and I do Magic Merge, on the other hand, then when I zoom in, it's totally clear and empty inside. And this would be manifold and watertight and could be printed. But it would be printed solid. And when it's printed solid, more material is used. So the more hollow you can get it, the cheaper it will be for you. Yeah. Yeah, totally. So in this guide, let's look at how we would start to process it. It's a very complicated model with lots of random booleans and spline wraps and different effects. And I would go through and be careful with each one to make sure that I treat it correctly. So making it editable inside first, Connect Objects and Delete, opening it up, grabbing all of my objects, the eye especially, since it is using a Boolean. I want to make sure I reduce it first before I do the rest of it. There's a lot of random things that can go wrong. But we're going to reduce all of these friends into their basic geometry. And then we will use our Magic Merge to put them back together again cleanly. Okay, we got all of that. I'm going to make sure we gather them all up and take them, and here is the plugin, Magic Merge, and it brings them all together. I am going to use another quick little trick with this before I merge it any further. there's this selection manager that is an easier way for you to view the polygons, the polygon selections. I'm making a polygon selection that just is the top of my file so I can reference it later when I need to separate it. We'll do that, and then we'll bring our bottom and our top, and I'm going to merge them together so they take away all of the information that's on each side. And then I have to separate them out now, and I can go back quickly and find my top and select just the polygons that are in the top selection. Let's try to select all. I'm going to try this one more time with a new polygon selection because that one didn't appear to work. Top one. Okay. So grab these, plug in Magic Merge them, and then I'll go back with my top selected. I'm going to copy the whole thing and make a second copy, and then I'll select select it, and I'm going to delete it off the top, and I'll call this guy bottom because I've taken the top off of him. Go back here, and I'm now going to invert my selection and delete off just the bottom, so this guy is my top. Now, if everything worked well, I should have clean and simple geometry, and I've split it into two, primarily for 3D printing, printer limitations. If you're trying to go big, you can't often go as big as you'd like. If you can separate it into two files and print it in two parts, you can get larger size. All right, I'm going to delete, I'm going to hide my top, and let's just look at how we might finish this guy off. Well, there is a fun little area down here that I didn't used to know about, mode modeling and mesh checking. So you can enable mesh check, and for the purposes of 3D printing, we're not really concerned about the isolated points or the poles. The ones that are really important for this are non-manifold and boundary edges, and this will quickly pop up and show you what you're dealing with and what you have to optimize. So I'm grabbing my selection tool, and I'm just going to grab this extra geometry that we don't need. I like to do it by selecting it and then using UY to grow my selection. Grow it up really big till I'm sure I selected all of those errant polygons and delete it off. So that dropped our selection down. I can go back here again and select it. And I also know that this row of polys is pretty messy, so I'm just going to delete that out. Select it one more time. We're now down to just 311 ones. And the way I will close this model off is as simply as possible because nobody's going to see this part. So if it's not going to be seen, the lower poly, the better. I'm still selected on edge mode. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit and then do MT to extrude and bring in a layer. Bring it down. MT again to bring in another one. Oh, I've got some weird geometry selected down there. Oh, okay. There. I prepped this one ahead of time and already made some edges down there. Let's close these guys off quickly with a closed polygon hole. This was the thing. This was the thing that went wrong. Something's always got to go wrong. I'll close my polygon hole because it was getting ahead of me. Close. Close. And then jump back out to where we were. with our bottom. Here, mode, you're just getting a review. Modeling, select, and let's try one more time to extrude our guy in and make a nice clean gradation in here. It'll be flat there, so the object has something to sit on. And then we will pull it down. And again, when we've got a little guy in there, we'll just close the polygon hole again. So one more. And mesh, commands, close polygon hole, create tool. And this guy can sometimes, there we go. Sometimes finding that exact little spot is hard. So I already kind of gave you a preview of what's going to happen on the boots. The other thing I did to optimize this along the same lines of anything you don't see, eliminate polys, is use my selection tool to select all of these faces. And this one is not an even selection, so I'm going to go back and just clean that up here. Using the shift key to add to my selection, I'm going to make this a nice clean square. And then I'll do mesh, command. I want to melt them together so I have just a single object. And this time I'm going to do MW to do an inner extrude. And then I'll lift this guy up and hollow out my boot. Save a little money. Save the money wherever you can, I guess. So that is about what we need to do to get this guy all ready to go. And then when he is, STL is generally a format that most 3D printers will take. So hopefully this will get you on your way to taking your existing 3D files and making them into usable 3D models. We are coming to the end, my friends. So again, I'm Megan, and you can find me at my website, Calcium75. If you're interested in the Augmented Reality app, you can check it out at presence.co. It's a beta, so you can get it on your very own phone. And if you're looking for other augmented reality resources, I collected up a bunch of the links that I found really useful that other people had put on the internet. So that is not a bad spot to go. And that is what I have for you, friends. Thank you.